Hey everyone, I'm Michael. I am a product designer on the secure team. Today I wanted to talk to you about the current state of enabling and configuring security scanners in GitLab and what we've been doing to better understand how we can improve that process going forward. So to start, I just want to ask, how many of you have actually tried to enable a security scanner within GitLab? I imagine a few of you probably have, but most of you likely have not. So as it stands today, GitLab offers 9 security scanners for our ultimate users, and 6 of those scanners can be enabled directly within the UI. If you consider the fact that just a year and a half ago, GitLab only offered 5 scanners and none of them could be configured within the UI, we can appreciate how much of a value add this is for our customers. So if we take a look at the current configuration page, to get there within the context of a project, you go to the security and compliance section and then the configuration. So this page has obviously gone through a bit of a redesign and a number of updates from what we saw just a year and a half ago. But the fact of the matter is that all of these tools are currently owned by different teams, and so they were planned and developed by different teams. And many of these experiences are still an MVC or within their first few iterations. So if you spend some time and actually look around this page and go through the different configuration workflows here, we can actually start to see that there's a lot of opportunity for improvement. One really good example of that is that there's actually 3 separate ways you can configure a scanner within the UI here. So at its most basic, we have tools like infrastructure as code and dependency scanning, where you come in here and it's essentially a really simple process. Where you come in and click on this configure with merge request button. And then that basically packages together a merge request. And then users, all they have to do is basically follow through that merge request process to enable the scanner itself. And then there's other scanners like SAST, which is a pretty similar configuration workflow, except for actually providing users with a few options that they can come in here and sort of tune the scanner and choose which analyzers, let's zoom in the way here, which analyzers they want to include. And then there's even some options around specific things within the analyzers themselves. But if you contrast that to something like our dynamic analysis scanners, let's look at DAST, for instance. We can see that this is already a much different looking experience. So we're actually asking users to come in here and create sort of separate artifacts to be able to enable the scanner. So we're asking them to create a scanner profile, which is sort of a separate workflow in and of itself, and then create a site profile. And then instead of sort of packaging that all up into an automatic merge request, we're actually just generating the code snippet for users and then send them off to the pipeline editor to be able to add that in themselves. So obviously that's a much different experience than the other 2 configuration workflows that I just showed you. So with that in mind, and then knowing obviously secure is still pretty new at GitLab, and there's a lot of room for growth, we just wanted to take a step back and think about the configuration experience as a whole. Just want to think about how we can align the experiences and make the process just more scalable and consistent going forward. And so our first step to doing that is really to evaluate the current experience, looking at sort of all the tools as a whole and not just each one individually. And ultimately, we wanted to understand what are the similarities and differences between the workflows and UI patterns that are being used. How well are we guiding users through this process? And how easy is it for new users to come in and figure this stuff out? So we approached this from a couple different angles. So our first approach was to evaluate the learnability and usability of the current experience. And so we basically conducted a couple UX scorecard evaluations to accomplish that. So I partnered with a couple other product designers. So Libor came in and evaluated the process of configuring our source code scanners. So he's looking at SAST, secret detection, and dependency scanning, and going through and evaluating the process of enabling those for the first time. And then Michael Lee came in and looked at our dynamic analysis scanners. So he was looking at DAST and API fuzzing and kind of going through that configuration process for the first time. And then I collaborated with both of them to kind of go through their evaluations and create recommendations based off of what they find in their experiences going through. And then we actually had a bonus UX scorecard come in from the growth team. So Matei did a UX scorecard on secure onboarding, where he basically came in and evaluated what it's like for a brand new GitLab user to come in and enable SAST for the first time. So after evaluating the usability and learnability of the experience, we then wanted to just understand what are the UI elements and workflows that we're currently using within the configuration process. And so we basically did an audit for the security configuration area. And what that process looked like is essentially we identified all of the different scanners that have configuration UIs. And then for each one of those, we basically went through, identified the relevant jobs to be done for each of them. So the Secure and Protect team already had a few jobs that were relevant to configuration. So basically just identified those jobs, and they're at high level enough where they really applied the configuration process for all of our scanners. So we pulled all those in, and then I basically worked through the workflow, configuration workflow for each scanner, essentially taking screenshots of all the various states and stages and sort of touch points that a user would encounter when trying to configure a security scanner. And then on top of that, we also documented the workflow that users go through, mostly looking at the happy path here. But as you can see for SaaS, it's a pretty simple process where you come in from the home page into the security configuration page, and then into the SaaS specific page, and then basically through the merge request process. But if you contrast that with something like DAST, which if you remember that UI was obviously much different, we can see that through the workflow here that the whole configuration process that we're sending users through is quite a bit different. So it starts out in a similar way where you're coming through the home page and the security page and into the DAST area. And then it kind of goes off on its own. So you're coming in and asking users to create or select site profiles and then scanner profiles. And then we're looking at essentially how compatible, or if those two profiles are compatible, and then basically going through the whole code snippet and CI pipeline editor process. So obviously it's a much, much different workflow than the simpler process like SAST. And so after we worked through after we basically went through the workflow and captured the screenshots and the workflow itself, I then went to seek out any sort of new relevant issues to get a sense of what was kind of planned for all of these scanner configurations going forward, to have a sense of how they were how teams were thinking about how they're going to grow and evolve over time. I then sat down and sort of evaluated how well each of these scanners currently satisfy the jobs to be done statements that we identified, and then basically documented all of the individual insights that were unique to the scanners, and then looked at the scanners sort of as a whole to evaluate how well they stacked up and compared against each other. So that's a summary of the process that we went through. So now I want to share with you some of the results we identified by going through this process. So the first thing we learned is that it's really not easy to get started with security in GitLab. The entry point into security really isn't that easy to find, and the features don't currently communicate the problems being solved with value to new users all that well, at least not within the configuration workflow. And the process of configuring security tools can be perceived as pretty complex, especially for those who are unfamiliar. And we really weren't doing much to educate users about that within the UI, which brings us to our next theme, is that user guidance throughout the configuration journey is relatively minimal. So we aren't providing users with much support other than linking them out to the documentation. And in fact, the guidance actually mostly drops off when the configuration workflow takes users away from the security configuration area. We actually saw this supported within the UX scorecard evaluations, where all three of the evaluations determined that it was pretty difficult to determine when a security tool was enabled or if it was configured properly. And really what that boiled down to is that the change in system status wasn't really easily discovered, and it wasn't clear where to go to confirm that the tool is enabled or where to view the results. And then on top of that, we also weren't doing much currently to help users recognize, diagnose, and recover from errors throughout the configuration process. So the scanners with UI configuration options, all of them handle field errors a little bit differently, and some of the fields actually have no validation at all right now. The next thing that we learned is that there seemed to be a lot of variation across the different configuration workflows. So as I showed up before, there's currently 3 possible workflows that a user could enter into to enable a scanner within the configuration or within the UI. And then another good example of that is DAS and API fuzzing. They both have the concept of profiles, but they both currently approach it slightly differently, and they present that concept slightly differently to users. And I think that's mostly due to the maturity of both of those configuration options right now. So there's a lot of opportunity to just align on the UI patterns, the workflows themselves, and the overall concepts. And then the last theme that we noticed or that we learned from this evaluation is that as it stands today, the current configuration process for most of the scanners don't fully satisfy the jobs to be done, at least not through the UI. So only 2 out of 3 of the jobs to be done are largely unaddressed by the UI right now. And the other configuration job to be done is pretty much addressed by only about half of the scanners, which isn't really great. So after completing the evaluation, we feel we have a pretty good understanding of some of the larger pain points and opportunities throughout the security configuration process at GitLab. So our next step is to then look outside of GitLab and hopefully learn from our target audience a bit. So I'm planning a contextual inquiry study to help better understand how teams integrate security tools into their CI/CD pipelines. And then from there, probably planning to spend some time learning from competitors as well. So doing a competitor evaluation or two, just to get a sense of how competitors are solving similar problems for their users, and just understand what they've done in the past or what's been done in the past. And then from there, we can basically start iterating on the experience. So we'll start by identifying and planning out our priorities, revising and aligning on an ideal user journey, and then collaborating to improve the experience from there. And there you have it. So that's pretty much what we're doing to understand how security configuration can be improved at GitLab. Thank you.
Nice job, Michael. Thanks for the overview.
Thank you.
Looks like Christy, you're the first person, first comment.
Yes, and I'm trying to add a second comment. So, okay, let me finish adding that kind of. So first, I just wanted to make a comment. This is such a great example of how learnability is important throughout the user's life cycle of using our product. So I think we have a tendency to think that, well, like learnability is important for new users. It's important for our more basic workflows that everyone is using. And you're giving a great example here of how that is not true. Learnability is important for experienced users too, who might have been using some of our more core product areas and are going then to add something like security to their usage, which from our business standpoint is really, really important. And we want to really enable that and make it as easy as possible. I think we also have a tendency to think, well, if someone's configuring security, then they're deeply technical and it's fine. Like the old trope of like developers don't care about usability, right? We know that that's not true. But as I was watching what you were presenting, I was seeing so many opportunities for ways that we could improve. So thank you for giving us a case in point of how learnability is critical all of the time. Really appreciate that.
Thanks, Christy. Valerie, you have the next one?
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just love seeing the connection of using jobs to be done. I know that's been a big question that many designers have had is, I know we use these for UX scorecards, but then how do you actually use it elsewhere? And I love seeing the connection of, yes, we did UX scorecards, but then you went back and you did this evaluation and you tied it back to those 3 jobs to be done. That's well done. Thank you for giving us a wonderful example of how to use it.
Thanks, Valerie.
And then I have the next one, but I think, yeah, this is going to transition into Valerie's comment because I think she and I are kind of honing in on the same thing here. So I love that you did this foundational work. And I know like now you're getting kind of ready to take that next step. As I was watching what you were showing that's in production, wow, do we have some opportunities for improved interaction design and visual design? Seeing I saw at least 6 primary CTAs on one of the pages. I saw, boxes everywhere. I saw an example where there were 2 primary CTAs and then like a secondary CTA underneath that I couldn't figure out, like, how do any of those things even interact with each other, tie together? So as you're starting to make proposals around this, are those the types of things that you're also going to be looking at?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's something that's very much worth considering because a page with 6 primary action buttons is never great.
It was confusing and hard to see, hard to scan.
No, that's great. Thanks for calling that out.
Yeah, and just to tag on to that, Jeremy made a wonderful unboxing the UI video which gave a lot of inspiration to kind of how you can look at our UI and then some very practical things that we could do to move forward. So I was wondering if you had an opportunity to watch that video, what are some things that you would apply to the current configuration workflow?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I did watch the video, and obviously I thought it was super awesome and very informative. I think there's a couple areas. So one thing I'm thinking about is the DAS configuration area. Right now, it's very just boxy in general. And you basically, when you come to that page and you fill it all out, you basically just have two large boxes on the screen. And I don't think it's really helping anything right now. So just thinking about how we can clean that up and make that information a little bit more just digestible, I think is one big area of that. And then as Christy pointed out on the main security configuration area right there too, I think there's a lot of opportunity to think about how we can unbox that. I haven't really done a lot of explorations in about how we can approach it yet, but I know there's definitely quite a bit of opportunity.
Becca, did you want to voice your comment to something Christy had said?
Yeah, just that's something that we've struggled with is because we have 3 primary routes of configuration, as Michael did a great job of showing. We've struggled with, do we try to set those expectations with the button copy, or do we just say enable on all of them, even though they kind of go off in different paths? But the reason that we ended up with the varying button copy is to try to set expectations for what's to come next. Is it going to be a merge request page? Is it going to be a configuration page before you create a merge request? Is it not a merge request page at all? And I think Michael's presentation did a great job of just showing how this current experience maybe isn't working so well. But that's just some more context there on why we have so many different button copy.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Becca. I'll say the button copy isn't even what caught me, because we went through it too quickly for me to even notice that there were differences there. Just the fact that we're using primaries everywhere. I mean, I'm going to say the simplest possible thing, which is, do we even need a primary on that page? To me, a primary says like, this is the one thing that you're here to do. And what that design is telling me is, no, there's like 6 or 8 different things that you could do. Could those have been secondary buttons instead of primary buttons? I think that would give probably a better weight to the mental model of what's happening there. So I am not saying that that is the answer. Please don't take that as prescriptive. That's more of just kind of a, we probably could have made a better decision there, even just from a visual design standpoint.
Yeah, even that's really tricky, of course, because I mean, with SAST, we decided to go with a primary button for enabling it to kind of call more attention to the fact that it's not enabled. And then once it is enabled, it switches to a secondary button. And if you want to go back and configure the way that SAST runs. So the idea there was that primary, grab your attention, this isn't enabled, come and enable it. And then it switches to secondary because it's like, okay, it's enabled, but if you want to come in and configure some things, you can do that. So I can't speak for the other scanners, like, because I was just on static analysis initially, but there was some thought that went into the primary versus secondary.
I'm going to be super provocative. Yeah, let me be super provocative for a moment here. There's probably another way that we could, so I will say, I would not expect to see in the button whether or not something is enabled. Like the button state would not in any way make me think like this is enabled or not, or disabled. We have other patterns in our product for doing that. So now I'm even more provocative and say, what are those buttons really doing? They're navigating you to another page. What component do we use for navigation? Links, right? And that would have really, I think if we had really thought about the components and what they are for and how we are using them and how we might use them differently, we might have come up with some really interesting, more easily scannable ways to display that information and give people a better expectation of like what's gonna happen next. When I click a button, like I expect like something's gonna happen, not that I'm just gonna go someplace else. So,
For
professional,
sure. That
take
makes
it for
sense.
what it's worth.
Room for improvement for sure. Thank you.
All in all, I think this is an excellent reason on why we're doing this evaluation. And also,
Yeah.
I think this, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to be clear, like, I'm not trying to pick on anybody or like say, like, why did you do this? But these are the opportunities for us to look at when we have a lot of different people designing against the same thing and we're not coordinating those efforts and we're not thinking about it holistically. It's really easy for things like this to happen. And then we go back and we all look at it as designers and kind of go, oh, well, that wasn't ideal. So not picking, but also just calling out, this is a problem for us. And it's going to continue to be a problem for us because of the type of product that we work on. Like these are the real sticky points that we just as a team probably need to work on getting better at.
It's also kind of a microcosm of how you can see how different designers approach similar but different problems in different ways. And it shows a little bit on how complicated our product is and how we can really easily run into the silo wall. And
Yeah,
this is happening on a small team like Secure and Protect. What are we doing across all teams?
Yeah, and I can also see an argument for, so there was a pattern already there, and now I'm coming to add something that's similar. Do I use the pattern that's already there for consistency, or do I rethink what's there today? And I think sometimes we back ourselves into corners that way, because we kind of like unintentionally set a standard, and then all of a sudden it's not a scalable standard, and it starts to grow. And then because of the way that we work, again, we're working it sometimes in silos, like whose responsibility is it to go and address that fundamental usability issue? I would say, it's everyone's responsibility, but I get where the tension of that comes in.
For sure. All right, thank you. Does anyone have any other questions or comments? I think there were a few in chat. I don't know if anyone wants to voice those. Austin, maybe? No, check out those if
Sorry, Mom. I was on my phone, so it was confusing. Yeah, this came up recently as a discussion of like whether or not buttons can be used as links. And I think the answer is like, no, they can't act as links, but you can style links to look like buttons. So I think that could be confusing just visually when something looks similar, but I think it's because buttons can line up next to each other. Have to look into it more.
Okay, cool. Thanks for voicing that. I appreciate it. Anyone else?